G'day and welcome to Talking Leadership. This is Eric Perez, your podcast host. Thanks for joining me again, and I hope you enjoyed today's content. And by way of introduction, I'd like to welcome today's guest, who is an enabler, an engineer, an entrepreneur, and a diversity advocate. Can I welcome to the podcast Gunilla Burrowes? I'd like to welcome to the podcast Gunilla Burrowes. How are you, Gunilla?
Oh, very well, thank you. How are you?
I'm fantastic. Look, thank you for joining me. So let's start where I often start these podcasts at first question, which is, in which industry was your first leadership role and why did you take that on?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question, actually, to reflect back on. And I have to go reasonably early in my career because I think it's a role that really has had the biggest impact on both the trajectory and the thinking of my career. And it was when my husband and I first moved to Newcastle for his work, and we had just started a family, so I was looking for work, and part-time work, in fact. So I just happened to knock on the engineering dean's door at the University of Newcastle, and it was that perfect timing where they were just about to, or wanted to, employ a female engineer that was willing to establish the first Women in Engineering project. So I applied and was lucky enough to be employed as a lecturer and to be that first Women in Engineering project manager. And I think using that as the first leadership role, because I suppose for the first thing, it was I was the only female academic in the faculty. I believe the faculty had only had one other female employed in its past. So it was a very unusual experience and a huge learning curve, both personally and professionally, even though I think people might sort of say, well, as a female engineer, you probably would have experienced quite a bit of that before. But I suppose it was the fact of going into such a different career path. Up until then, I'd been predominantly on a fairly normal industry career trajectory as an engineer. So I think I really grew as a leader because I think I saw the opportunity that this position gave me. And I mean, it was, as I said, it was a very unusual time in that, just to take you back, it was the philosophy at the time, I think, around gender in the workplace was what they called the deficit model. So that is where they viewed women had to change to fit into the culture, and that it was really expected that women were required to fix this women's problem. So that was quite a burden to take on. But as I said, I really saw it as an opportunity. And I think I really grabbed onto that opportunity, with everything that I had, even though I was doing it part-time and was trying to raise two beautiful children at the same time. But I've seen since then, I think it's called the Oz principle, see it, own it, solve it, do it. And I think I took that on very much. So those opportunities, I was going to say, were things like just sitting on the faculty board and university senate, putting my hand up and saying, I want to be on those decision-making bodies. I can see the importance not only of the exposure that you have in those places, but the ability to be able to make changes. And then I also was, because it was a new role and I had that opportunity to establish it in the way I liked, I also took on broader roles, including leading, or first, I suppose, negotiating and bringing to Newcastle the third National Indigenous Summer School. So I really, thought it's beyond gender here. I thought that this was a really amazing program, and it was fantastic there then to work with Wallatuka, which is at the University of Newcastle, and incorporate that within my thinking. And, you know, I also negotiated with science faculty to incorporate a engineering section out in their summer school, their science summer school, and actually managed to change it to the science and engineering summer school. And that program that I ran then for several years has become an international program called the Science and Engineering Challenge. It's interesting to, feel, looking back at the burden that I kind of took on at the time, but it was, I think, that the leadership skill of seeing opportunities and working those opportunities that were really valuable lessons. And I do have to say too, I think the other really valuable lesson was understanding yourself. So it was a real personal learning journey for me to start to understand why, or put myself in other females' shoes and understand why women weren't choosing to do engineering and what was holding them back from that decision.
Bring up a couple of interesting issues there that in answering why did you take on the roles that you've just discussed. That one was a deeply personal one. The other one was very much a strategic choice that once you get in there and you can be on decision-making groups or bodies or governing coalitions of people, that you can help change the discussion in those different contexts. And yeah, it sounded like you took on a fair bit at a time when you said you were just moved to Newcastle with a young family. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. And it was interesting because, that idea, that you're on a fairly normal career trajectory, and then, you're suddenly taken out of that. Partly it was because we decided to move to a new city, but it was also that I was looking for part-time work rather than full-time work because I just started our family. Yeah, so recognising that I needed to find a different way of doing things, and I suppose accepting that in a way, and recognising that I had to make the most of that opportunity was really, really important. But yeah, you can't underestimate actually just recognising the importance of the self-awareness and the emotional intelligence that I think that particular role led me down was, absolutely critical to, what I have, I think, done in my future career.
Sure. And I think you used the terminology, a normal career path. I don't think such a thing exists. And I don't say that to denigrate people's career choices. I think things happen sometimes for a reason, sometimes just out of sheer chance. Because using my experience, for example, I never would have thought starting at university when I was in my very early 20s that I'd end up working in the industries that I've worked in now, with a variety of different jobs that I've had in a career. And I think that's the template that I'll use until I retire.
Thinking about this in a different time, I suppose I probably use that normal career path for the 90s, that when I was talking about, because even 30 years ago there were different expectations and understanding of what work was, and so it might seem more normal now to be able to jump between industry and academia and this industry and that industry more than it was, I think, in those days, or at least the experience that I had. So that's why I use the word normal, I think, in that role.
If you're talking about career paths in this decade and the decade to come, I think not normal will probably be the normal going forward, because people now are looking for careers that spark something, a passion in them to do a particular a particular role because you're at work for so long that you want to try and enjoy what you're doing. I know that's not always possible, and it gets a lot easier to do when you've got some experience under your belt. But can I ask you, in your experience, have you found that there's a difference between what we call the leadership function versus management?
I'll say yes, theoretically, but I think they're really part of a continuum in that practically, I think now people need to really integrate almost together, or at least integrate them more in the discussions and the educational programs that I still see around. You know, if you think, I think traditional idea of leadership and management have been, you know, leaders lead people and managers have people work for them. But I mean, managers now need to inspire and motivate more than ever to get their staff to work, you know, successfully together. And of course, those are really been considered leadership skills. And likewise, you know, good leaders need to be able to forward plan and strategically think and program and problem solve. And they've all been, you know, more often considered management skills. So I suppose for me, the integration has really become quite a lot clearer with the work that I do around gender equity, but as well as, you know, this entrepreneurial or tech space where I'm really seeing the workplace changing. I think, I mean, just the digital technologies are changing the way we work as we are seeing now with the coronavirus impact. And so now more than ever, I think that we really do need to recognise about moving away from what those traditional models of leadership have been. And I suppose the Western view from my perspective in those traditional ways is a charismatic leader, an autonomous charismatic leader. And I really think that it's now time to focus on more inclusive leadership. So that's that integration. It's really about a human orientation, a lot more about team work. And I love, you know, reading more about the humble leader. You know, I see those sort of characteristics are becoming more and more important. So to me, you know, that inclusive leadership really illustrates that interwovenness or the areas of management and leadership. And you know, that it might, I was going to say, I suppose it might seem counterintuitive in some ways going into this digital world that we need to focus more on a human-centric approach. But I think that's where this inclusive leadership is so critical now, and why I see that the differences between leadership and management are blurring so much more.
I appreciate that response. That we could unpack that for hours. I can't, but I can understand why you bring up those topics. And just to add something to what you said at the end there about technology, I think technology, for all its wondrous efficiencies and the things that it can help us to do, that may be dehumanizing the world of work rather than humanizing the world of work.
Yeah.
That will, you know, that's a bone of contention for a lot of people, and I think those in the IT space would shoot me for saying that, but I do believe that that's a whole raft of research in that area alone about to what extent is technology enabling better connectivity between people at a time when if your contention is yes, the leadership models need to move to a more person-centric view of the world and more about ethical leadership, that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
It's about the people, not necessarily the process. It's open to debate, I would have thought, and open to discussion about how does that fit in some industries versus others. So I think in some industries that change of model is a lot easier to do because of the nature of the culture of some workplaces, not all.
Yeah.
But I think culture is one that, and not many people talk about that as a potential barrier to changing thinking around leadership. So no, thank you for.
But we are all going to be impacted by technology. I think we are actually feeling it now that we are, looking at, experiencing this COVID-19 response. And, it is for us to actually integrate technology appropriately into the workplace and into our lives, that we need to be a lot more aware of our humanness in a way, and be able to integrate that. And that's why I think leaders need to very much focus on this inclusive leadership, or be very much more aware of that, and aware of that integration of management and leadership in that space.
Well, I just want to ask you the next question. This one, I'm interested to get your response on this. Leaders sometimes make mistakes. So how do you engage with an error or mistake that's attributed to your leadership, Gunilla?
Well, I suppose following on from the last comment, being human is about recognising, being human is about making mistakes. I think being able to recognise and accept them is absolutely critical, and just being honest and humble about mistakes that you might have made, because I suppose it's that, it's about allowing yourself to really learn from them, and hoping that those around you respect you and support you enough to do that. Because from my point of view, and I've learnt this too, I think in the entrepreneurial space, is making the same mistake again is the problem. Making it the first time is okay, as long as you've learnt from it. It's these repeating mistakes that is problematic. And so I suppose the way I engage, I suppose, if I've made mistakes, is looking at just being human and trying to accept that.
Yeah, no, that's great, and I think and it's one of those things with the leadership process that you're not learning if you're not prepared to accept that you're going to have bumps in the road or mistakes either generating from you or the people that you're working with. And I tend to agree, and the feedback that I've had from other entrepreneurs that have been on these podcasts that have suggested, you need to learn from those mistakes, and if you're not learning from them, then it's something else. Maybe you need to challenge your thinking on some things if you're not learning from that part of the process. And I tend to agree that errors or mistakes or little issues that come up when you're working can be used as opportunities to do better later. And others, everyone without exception, and yourself, I'll add you to the list, has said these are things to learn from and opportunities to do better in the future rather than being potential roadblocks. So just linked to that question before is, and again, not trying to take too negative a tone here, is what have you found in your travels is the most difficult part about being a leader?
Well, for me personally, about the fact that I think I'm a bit of an extrovert, and that I've got to stop talking and actually spend a bit more time listening. Well, it's not so much, not only that, it's about really not pushing my views all the time. Yeah, so that has been a difficult part of being a leader. So I suppose the difficult part is being who I am, in a way. And I suppose that is why, I come back to that self-awareness and self-understanding is so critical in being, a really good leader. Because I think recognizing that how valuable other people's views and approaches are important, and recognizing that, people behave and think differently, but that is so important to incorporate into your view. And, when you're looking for a solution, you want to look at as many possibilities as possible to really come to the best solution. So, I'd have to say you're learning not to push your own view is a really important part of a really difficult part of my leadership journey. And then I think, but on the female side, is not being visible. And I think maybe before the podcast we talked about that briefly. So as a female leader, it's interesting sort of being invisible, and so that can be quite difficult when you are trying to make a change, and you're trying to convince and inspire people. If they don't believe that you should be there, but not because it's you, but because you're a woman, and there's a belief that women shouldn't be leaders in that particular area or something like that, I think that can be a really difficult part of being a female leader, particularly in more traditional industry sectors.
Previous podcast guest talked about that, as well as being from a different ethnic origin, and so being a female from a different cultural group working in an industry that is typically dominated by men. That is an issue that she found a little bit difficult to deal with, but forged ahead and decided that she wasn't going to wear the tag of being tarred with a particular brush, and just did what she had to do in that space to get the recognition that she thought she deserved. And yeah, it's 2020. You would think that some of this stuff is not something that weighs on people's minds in that leadership space, but obviously it does. And I guess it's a reality of the differences between workplaces, let alone between industry sectors, and the kind of money that you'll get just at that level throws up a lot of questions around.
But it can be a double-edged sword, because in a way, that if you are kind of assertive about your particular position and and want to lead or whatever it is, if you can be very assertive, but that can actually be misunderstood if as being aggressive, because there's that, well, it's an unconscious bias often that women are not leaders, or a particular race mightn't fit that particular stereotype. And so the more you push against that stereotype can actually be a bit of a double-edged sword, because you can actually make it almost worse for yourself. So it's a difficult area, I think, of leadership for those in non-traditional areas, shall I say.
Let's talk about measuring success. So how do you measure success as a leader? And I asked this question not in terms of, did you succeed? Did you get the KPI? Did you make the money for the quarter? That, not talking those measures, and if you want to use them, that's great. But I'm talking in broad terms. What are the factors that you see as success as a leader from your experience?
Yeah, well, look, I think that the main thing is being able to leverage someone else's strengths and skills. So I think good leaders are those I can see that have recognized and almost led from behind, dare I say, given responsibility to someone with or without support, but to let them succeed in their own right. And I think that's really an important measure of success. And I suppose it also the other way around as well, that people trust you with responsibility, when you feel that, there's that kind of recognition that you've been successful, I suppose. And I was just thinking, the example that comes to mind is when I was asked to chair 1804, which is an incubator and co-working space here in Newcastle for startups and scale-ups. But what's, really unique and significant about it is it was the first incubator in the clean tech and smart city area in Australia. But when I was asked to do it, I obviously took it on as this incredible opportunity. It was a new idea, and I could see, why we needed to do it. But the fact that I've had the incredible support from those same people over the last 5 years as we've grown, and I mean, it has become successful and a really important part of the ecosystem, I think has been really important. And I feel very much trusted by those individuals, and I think that's kind of felt a measure of success as a leader for me. It's been really a lovely personal, tick in the box, dare I say. So I think, asking to, so being asked to contribute and to continue, to lead in other areas, shows success as well.
Gunilla, this is the bit of the podcast where I'm just want your views on a couple of statements that I've got here, and again, very interested to see what you've got to say. So let me start at the top of this list. On-the-job experience develops better leaders.
Yes, I think practice is very important to make perfect. Yeah, practice makes perfect in a way. The practice side is where you really start recognizing what works and what doesn't.
So let me then pose the following as the other end of the spectrum to that previous statement is formal education helps to develop better leaders.
Yeah, yes, I think that theory and frameworks I think can really help structure conversations and approaches to things, which I think then can help, communication. So I think communication is really critical for leaders. I'm not saying one-way communication at all. I'm talking about two-way. But, sometimes having that kind of framework to use can make things go a lot smoother. And I suppose formal education really is where a lot of that sort of theory and framework is developed. So, for sure, I think it's as important as the practice in many ways.
Here's the last statement for you, and this one I'm really keen to see what you've got to say about this one. Leaders are born, not made.
So I say no. I hesitate because I think I probably have wondered, but I say no generally because I do believe that some people have a more natural tendency towards leadership, but we're all influenced by social norms and cultures that really lend me to think, that we all need to learn, and even natural leaders can become better leaders. I would say no, but that I do recognise, I think some people have it a little bit easier. Saying that, you do see some, and I'm just trying to think of an example, which is probably why I'm hesitating, some people that you wouldn't even imagine to be a leader, and yet they're just the perfect person at that particular time to do the right thing, and people are really inspired by them. I would say no to leaders are born, not made.
That's okay. I myself am still a fence sitter on that one, and unashamedly so. I've experienced at least enough in my career and my life generally that I could make an argument for both. And I've one of the previous podcast guests sort of related to that nature versus nurture type argument, that sort of spectrum that, maybe some are have that X factor, and I hesitate to use that term because it's definitely not a scientific term. Something's got that mysterious unknown quality. I think when people talk about an X factor, I think what they really are referring to, if you unpack that a bit, is a combination of skills and traits and predispositions that outwardly make you seem like a very good leader. And again, I think it's a context specific thing, but we could talk about that. That could be another 20 or 30 podcasts, mate. So I'll hold you that to another conversation at another time, mate.
Absolutely.
So here's the bit in the podcast where I get to talk about some research that I'm doing. And again, I'm very early career researcher, so I don't claim to have all knowledge around this area, but I do have an interest in the following two leader capabilities, and that's strategy and foresight. I'm looking at them as being some of the most critical leadership capabilities that future leaders will need. Now, I don't say they're the only capabilities, but I think they're critical in the mix. And I just wanted to get your perspective on those two, if I could.
Yeah, foresight for sure. I completely agree with that, because I see it kind of as that, I've used opportunity, being able to take an opportunity and pick it up and, see it, own it, solve it and do it as important. On the strategic thinking side, my gut reaction was to stop and question that. But, I do recognise, if you think strategic in the sense of being open to learning and open to change, whether it's, innovative change or disruptive change, and I suppose if it's about asking questions, I definitely agree. Strategic thinking in that kind of contexts are all really important. But I think, as I've mentioned in the podcast, inclusive leadership is definitely one that I would put up there. Foresight and strategic thinking are very, I suppose, personal or individual characteristics, and don't necessarily bring in, I think, the human orientation that leaders need. So I would tend to add inclusive leadership qualities as being critical, particularly, for the future that or this digital future that we're now experiencing in many ways.
Sure. And so I'll steal that as a potential research topic once I finish my study. So
that's right.
I'll put that one away and put a copyright on it. So I've got a audio record of it, so I'll use that down the track, mate. So no, I do appreciate that as you're thinking on this. And again, I don't ask this. I've never asked this question around getting an okay from the podcast guests around, hey, they're the only ones, because I know that they're not. But I guess as part of the research process for me, I could have looked at hundreds of different leader capabilities and trying to get a study done in a fixed amount of time. You need to go with what's the word that they use, delimit your study. And from the literature that I've been reading, particularly around strategic thinking and foresight, that I can make the argument using the literature and what I've seen. I don't know, lived experience doesn't count when you're talking about an academic piece of work, but definitely the literature quite some strong support being there, but not to the exclusion of other things. And I think that's what you've identified. I would agree with that.
Yeah, and look, focus on your studies and PhD for sure. I would be very interested to understand how you describe strategic thinking, or what your.
And I'm happy to share that once the thesis is done. I'll make it available for people to have a look at, because one thing about this process that I've come to find that is a challenge for me. The way that I think about things is you need to get these ideas out there and have people not so much challenge why you did it, but discuss why you've gone the way that you've gone. And I can't wait to be able to publish it and get it out for people to critique and ask me questions, because again, it's never been in my mind about I don't think. Maybe other guests in the future will set me straight on this, that there is a magical set of capabilities that make for the best type of leader. For me, I think the terminology, and maybe it's the way that I ask this question, it's not about maybe better leaders, it's more effective leadership. That is there a set of these core skills in the current environment or future environments that you'll need to be able to navigate what leadership will mean in the future? And you've thrown a curveball at me a little bit when you're talking about, I know, and it's a good thing. I'm not saying it's a bad thing, that this, engaging with technology is a big issue, and the world of work in the future for me and for my kids and for everyone's kids in the future will be very much technology centered. And that's, I think when you look at what's happening, and I don't know why I would be talking about COVID-19 in a podcast, but I think this has brought up this idea that if we do go through these situations where you've got to be isolated in your home, that the technology offers a bridge to connect to other people that are in a very similar situation.
Yep.
And I think people will be writing about what we've been going through now for years, if not decades to come, on how we responded to this. So,
well, they talk about the new normal, don't they?
Yeah, whatever normal is at any given point in time. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
So look, Gunilla, this is the last question in the podcast, and this one I'm definitely keen to hear what you've got to say. What might you say to a younger version of yourself about being an effective leader?
Well, I've mentioned already that I really need to concentrate on remembering to listen and be patient. But I would say, actually, I think one of the most important things would be saying get more mentors earlier in your career.
You say earlier, is that, sorry to interrupt, because that one triggered something, because a lot of the podcast guests have talked about mentoring, and I won't get into whether it's better having a more formal versus a more informal mentor or set of mentors. But when you say early in your career, is that because you'll learn more in your formative stages as a young leader versus being able to draw some benefit as an older leader, as a more experienced leader?
Well, it's just more that, I suppose I had a view, I think, that you'd have one mentor or something. There would be somebody that you would all, find that would be, you would mentor. And then you might change them to another person. But I think I say get more mentors too, because I think, the more mentors that you can collect and interact with earlier on is a positive from my point of view. And some of those mentors end up becoming, I think, sort of not only a coach, but maybe even a sponsor for you. So that's why I say it takes time to develop a mentor relationship. And I think, being really brave early on in your career, if you can start developing those mentor relationships and have several of them, seeking advice from all over, I think would be something I definitely tell my younger self. I think also thinking more about, recognizing your unique characteristics, and so what you might bring to the roles that you take on. And then I suppose finally, really just back yourself, realize that you'll make it and find the right path on the terms that you can create. So back yourself would probably be my last sort of thought.
That's brilliant, and it's a very positive way to end the podcast. So Gunilla, thank you for your time.
Thank you, Eric. It was really enjoyed that.
For those listening, this is Talking Leadership. I'm Eric Perez, your podcast host. Thanks again for joining me. And look, I'm always looking for podcast guests to talk about their leadership experiences. So please reach out. I'll put the information to get in touch with me on this podcast when it gets. It's great to have these discussions. And again, for those listening, I've been talking to Gunilla Burrowes. Thanks again, mate.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. Really nice to meet you.
Thanks, everyone, and I'll catch you all in the next podcast.